The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History Magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History Magazine. It was a plague of biblical proportions. Swarms of locusts assaulted crops, tools, and clothing. The events not only devastated farmers, but it also foreshadowed today's expectations about the government's role during natural disasters. Today, we dive into the 2008 Nebraska History Magazine article, Grasshoppered, America's Response to the 1874 Rocky Mountain Locust Invasion, written by byAlexandra Wagner. During a severe drought in the summer of 1874, a plague of Rocky Mountain locusts, popularly called grasshoppers, denuded the fields and crushed the spirits of thousands of settlers in the Great Plains and Midwest. Reports of the infestation and destruction circulated throughout the nation and produced a widespread relief effort. Despite conflicting accounts of the damage the invasion caused, the event prompted new discussions on the merits of charity and whether states and the federal government should provide disaster assistance to the American farmer. The grasshoppers traveled in a perfect swarm. From July 20th to July 30th, 1874, an estimated 12.5 trillion insects flew over an area encompassing 198,000 square miles between Minnesota and the Rio Grande, and feasted on the crops of unsuspecting farmers. In the hardest hit areas, the red-legged creatures devoured entire fields of wheat, corn, potatoes, turnips, tobacco, and fruit. The hoppers also gnawed on curtains and clothing hung up to dry or still being worn by the farmers, who frantically tried to bat the hungry swarms away from their crops. Attracted to the salt from perspiration, the oversized insects chewed on the wooden handles of rakes, hoes, and pitchforks, and on the leather of saddles and harnesses. Locusts apparently liked onions. Farmers reported smelling a faint odor of the vegetable as the unwelcome visitors neared. Newspaper stories, along with the letters and diaries of Western farmers, reported that the locusts blackened the sky and their jaws crackled like a deadly fire as they ate fields bare. According to Nebraska historian Addison E. Sheldon, who witnessed the invasion, the insects filled the air in every direction. He said, quote, "In a clear, hot July day, a haze came over the sun. The haze deepened into a gray cloud. Suddenly, the cloud resolved itself into billions of gray grasshoppers sweeping down upon the earth. The vibration of their wings filled the ear with a roaring sound like a rushing storm. As far as the eye could reach in every direction, the air was filled with them. Where they alighted, they covered the ground like a heavy, crawling carpet." End quote. There were reports of hordes of grasshoppers so thick they halted a Union Pacific train at Stevenson Station near Kearney, Nebraska. Crushed insect bodies left an oily residue on the tracks that caused the wheels to spin and prevented the locomotive from moving forward. Locusts not only stopped trains and destroyed vegetation, but they also rendered poultry, an important food source on Western farms, inedible. During such raids, chickens and turkeys feasted on the grasshoppers. The digested insects tainted the meat and the eggs with this reddish-brown oil. The insect bodies also polluted water supplies. Cattle and horses refused to drink from streams stained brown from the grasshoppers' excrement and putrefied bodies. Farmers in affected regions constantly had to remove locust carcasses from their wells to avoid contaminating their drinking water. Eaten directly, however, grasshoppers were not poisonous to humans and, according to some, were quite tasty. Missouri's state entomologist Charles Riley claimed grasshoppers were as nutritious as oysters and could be used to make a variety of dishes, including soup or prepared John the Baptist style, fried with honey. Few farmers, however, were inclined to appreciate the grasshopper for their putative food value. The settlers used a variety of unsuccessful methods to kill or drive off the locusts and save their crops. Some tried covering their fields with sheets. Others burned fires to smoke grasshoppers away from their crops and into surrounding ditches filled with water and oil to drown them. Farmers built a variety of grasshopper traps and crushers. Some states enacted legislation to encourage the construction of grasshopper extermination devices by offering tax breaks and subsidies. Other states supported the protection of native grasshopper-eating birds, such as quail, prairie chickens, and snipe. These efforts and others failed to protect Western farms from the grasshopper's ravages. Entire crops were destroyed, some families starved, and thousands abandoned their homesteads for safer living in the East. Conservative estimates put the grasshopper damage to agriculture in 1874 at 50 million, approximately 74% of the total value of U.S. farm products. Western immigration suffered as a result of the invasion. In Dakota Territory, the number of homesteaders who left after the plague represented a significant portion of the total population. Fed-up farmers fleeing the devastation vented their frustration on wagon covers that proclaimed "eaten out by grasshoppers, going back east to live with the wife's folks," and "from Sodom, where it rains grasshoppers, fire, and destruction." For some victims, there was no escape. Mortgage debt, lack of transportation, or lack of an alternative destination tethered many settlers to their tattered farms. The Pawnee, Omaha, Odo, Ponca, and other Indian tribes who had seceded most of their land to the federal government in exchange for small reservations also suffered without recourse. For centuries, the locust lived, bred, and destroyed vegetation in many countries on several continents. In the Bible, the locust was one of the 10 plagues of Egypt that brought famine and distress. The damage to agriculture and threat of famine caused by these locust invasions, especially in developing countries, had led the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations to create and maintain a website, Locust Watch, to monitor the worldwide locust situation and keep affected countries and donors informed of expected developments. The bluish-gray Rocky Mountain locust that consumed $50 million worth of Western crops and halted a Union Pacific train in 1874 had red legs and ranged in length from a half an inch to 4 inches. Melanopolis spreadus, the locust's binomial name, was a type of migratory grasshopper that lived and bred in the dry Rocky Mountain Plateau and bordered high plains, which included parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and Canada. Until 1902, when the Rocky Mountain locust disappeared from North America, grasshopper raids occurred periodically, usually during warm summers and in the low rainfall. In 1874, increased reproduction and a shortage of food in their breeding grounds forced the locusts to take flight in search of new resources. In addition to the unprecedented size, scope, and duration of the 1874 grasshopper plague, drought and financial panic exasperated the destruction they caused. The July invasion coincided with one of the driest periods ever recorded in the Midwest and Great Plains. While the locusts thrived in dry weather, farmers fretted as they watched their crops wither in the sun or disappear at the jaws of the ravenous creatures. Losses from the plague and drought were harder to recoup as the nation suffered from financial panic caused by the September 1873 collapse of the banking house of J. Cook and Company. Prices for agricultural goods dropped and investments waned. Historian James C. Olson explained that even before the grasshoppers arrived in the summer of 1874, many Nebraska farmers were having trouble finding markets for their wheat and their corn. In August 1874, after the hoppers had filled their bellies and laid their eggs, many Western newspapers and government officials denied that the locusts had caused anything other than limited damage. Fearful that negative publicity about the region would deter settlement and suppress investment, editors downplayed the extent of suffering and destruction caused by the grasshoppers. They wrote, quote, "We hear many great exaggerated reports of the damages that grasshoppers have done in Polk, Hamilton, York, and Butler counties, which are hardly credible, and it is of no earthly benefit to give them currency. In fact, we believe it is damaging to the future prospects of the different localities for the citizens to start such stories. Although this plague may not come next year, still the impression will gain credence in the East that some of these sections of country are doomed to suffer from grasshopper visits continuously because people will not stop to think that this is just a chance occurrence, end quote. Newspapers in the affected region resisted reporting negative details about the invasion primarily as a result of their dual role as both local media and unofficial immigration agents promoting Western settlement. As historian Harold E. Briggs explained, editors received, quote, thousands of letters from different parts of the country asking about land, climate, and general conditions, end quote, and sent copies of their papers to eastern states and also printed Boomer and Immigration editions. Initially, governors and local officials also hesitated to admit the extent of the grasshopper damage for fear that negative publicity about the region would impede development and investment. To relieve suffering without attracting national attention, the governors of Kansas and Nebraska set up internal private relief agencies to collect and distribute food and supplies to those worst hit by the plague. On September 15, 1874, Kansas Governor Thomas A. Osborne called a special session of the legislature to establish a central relief committee to chiefly secure aid within our own state and for the victims of the grasshopper plague. He said, quote, "The wishes of the people, so far as I've been informed, are entirely in favor of providing for the present emergency and for doing it at home. If you adhere to their wishes, the people of the whole nation will point to Kansas with pride as the state that never forgets the cry of the suffering and the destitute, and the state which steadily marches forward, made stronger by every adversity and more powerful by relying solely upon herself," end quote. Nebraska Governor Robert W. Furness presided over a similar organization, the Nebraska Relief and Aid Association, which was formed on September 18, 1874 to, quote, collect money, provisions, clothing, fuel, seeds, and other necessary supplies from private sources, end quote. During the first stages of the relief effort in the fall of 1874, officials and promoters from grasshoppered states insisted that local fundraisers, bond measures, and donations would support plague victims without the need to appeal for assistance from other states or the federal government. They also opposed any effort to tap the state treasuries, which were already depleted due to the effects of drought and the economic slowdown caused by the Panic of 1873. In the inaugural address of the Kansas Central Relief Committee, members expressed confidence that people in wealthier positions of the state from firmly established communities, quote, are both able and willing to render assistance, end quote, to the grasshopper sufferers. The editor of the Omaha Bee stated with equal certainty that local and private efforts would provide relief for plague victims. Quote, "We are confident that Nebraska will be able to take care of all the people who are really in want without legislative aid," end quote. Although preferring locally based relief to state or federal assistance, some doubted the effectiveness and merits of private charity, as this note in the Omaha Daily Republican suggested, quote, "There is no fault to find with the committee working for the relief of the grasshopper sufferers, and donations have been liberal, but the history of all such cases shows that the virtuous and proud poor sufferer, while the improvident and vicious are demanding and insolent, some impudent people will get more than they ever had, and the worthy starve, as was the case in the Chicago fire. Too much care cannot be observed in distribution. It is due alike to sufferers and contributors," end quote. As the grasshopper relief efforts increased toward the end of fall through the winter of 1874 and 75, warnings of abuse and reports of maldistribution of supplies appeared more frequently in Western newspapers. The history of the grasshopper relief effort illustrates the particular attitudes of local and federal officials, Western promoters, and Easterners toward charity during the 19th century. It is difficult to fully appreciate the responses to such natural disasters without understanding the ideological forces that directed them. Inherent skepticism of unrestricted charity and the belief that, with the exception of natural disaster victims, the poor were mainly to blame for their own situation influenced the grasshopper relief effort of 1874 and 75. Victims received public and private support because the nation viewed them as deserving poor, meaning that their condition had not resulted from their immorality, idleness, or individual failure. That many homesteaders were Union Civil War veterans also appealed to patriotic donors. Moreover, many Americans viewed the settlers as trailblazers who had willingly submitted themselves to the rigors of life on the frontier to advance the country's moral and material prosperity. As the Worcester, Massachusetts Daily Spy wrote, quote, "While we would remember the charity which begins at home, we ought not to forget that the duty presses upon us with paramount claim of doing our utmost to relieve from the horrors of starvation a community made up largely of people of New England extraction, many of whom fought in our defense, who are advancing the material prosperity of our country by voluntarily submitting to the hardships of frontier life," end quote. The view expressed by the Daily Spy and other newspapers of Western farmers as deserving of aid served as the central justification of the 1874-75 National Grasshopper Relief Effort. Despite the willingness of individuals, banks, and businesses from other states to send aid, not everyone welcomed the assistance. Land agents warned that too much relief would make farmers dependent on outside charity. The editor of the Vermilion Republican in Dakota Territory believed that pleas for help damaged the reputation of Western states. They wrote, quote, "There is not a county in Dakota but what is able, and amply able, to take care of its own poor. Had the legislature given county commissioners the power and authority to levy a direct tax on the respective counties to aid those in need of assistance within their limits, the whole work would have been done, and well done. And we should have been saved the wretched humiliation of going before the country as beggars and paupers, and the fair name and credit of Dakota from being dragged in the dust," end quote. The boosters' desire to facilitate economic development and maintain the perception of Westerners as rugged, self-sufficient, and independent collided with grasshopper victims' desperate need for assistance. As a result, relief efforts stalled, and many families suffered. The response to the grasshopper plague of 1874-75 was similar to that following the 1871 Chicago fire, which caused nearly $200 million in damage. Both disasters, although local or regional in nature, drew national interest and the sympathy of residents living in the East and Northeast. 45% of the $4 million of outside aid to the Chicago fire victims came from Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Grasshopper relief organizations also collected a large portion of their aid from eastern states and cited the national response to the Chicago fire to justify assisting the grasshopper victims. Similar to Western boosters who argued that too much aid might render farmers soft, many prosperous Chicagoans had feared unfettered charity and the potential dark side of fire relief in 1871. According to historian Karen Sauerslack, the Chicago Relief and Aid Society, an organization established by the mayor and composed primarily of wealthy citizens, was, quote, "internally at war between a form of humanitarianism and conservative impulses, between a commitment to aid the poor and a desire to preserve what they viewed as a proper social order of their city," end quote. As a result of its schizophrenia of purpose, the Chicago Relief Society required a thorough investigation of every person seeking assistance. The Nebraska Relief and Aid Association employed similar tests for grasshopper victims to ensure that only worthy residents received temporary aid. To receive assistance, Nebraska farmers pledged an oath that they possessed nothing of value that could be sold for food or clothing. In a letter published by the Worcester Daily Spy, a Nebraska man described this process. It read, quote, "If a man wants help, he must go to one of the officers of the Relief Society and make a sworn statement that he has got nothing that he can sell to get anything with. He must sell his last cow and team. He must not have any seed wheat or any money, after which they will take his name for the committee to act upon. I have got a team yet, but I had to sell one horse the other day, which I received $10 for, worth $50, end quote. Similarly, in Minnesota, grasshopper-ravaged families had to prove their destitution and sell their livestock to receive succor. Despite the means test dictating how public and private aid was distributed to grasshopper victims in Nebraska, Accusations of corruption and stories of supplies going to undeserving homesteaders flooded the pages of the local press. At times, those on the receiving end of grasshopper relief also questioned the legitimacy of charity and public assistance. Many settlers regretted the need to appeal for outside help and believed charity should remain local. Some farmers refused to accept food, clothing, and other necessities except in the form of a temporary loan. The original Articles of Incorporation of the Nebraska Relief and Aid Association set up a system of lending money to destitute farmers because, as the Omaha Daily Republican explained, quote, people in the suffering districts in many instances refused to accept charity as a voluntary gift, alleging that they were not beggars and that they would receive money only on the basis of an ordinary business transaction, end quote. Although the Aid Association eventually abandoned the loan idea, some Nebraska counties sought ways to support individual farmers from the local treasury. In Hamilton County, commissioners discussed a special election to authorize issuing $50, $100, $150, and $200 loans at 10% interest to grasshopper sufferers who promised not to leave the county prior to repaying the loan plus interest. As winter approached and state and local relief agencies struggled to supply food and clothing to the thousands of grasshopper victims, the need to appeal for outside aid became more apparent to Western officials. The threat of starvation was becoming widespread. Army officers stationed in the Plains region were among the first to recognize the need. Moved by first-hand encounters with plague victims, Army officials stationed in the West to protect the new settlements from Indians assumed leadership of local relief associations and lobbied federal authorities for approval to distribute blanks, boots, and coats from the Army stockpiles. In late October 1874, General E.O.C. Ord, commander of the Department of the Platte and acting head of the Nebraska Relief and Aid Association, asked his superiors in Washington, D.C. for permission to distribute food and clothing to the, quote, famine-stricken families of southern and western Nebraska, end quote, where the Nebraska Relief and Aid Association lacked facilities. The War Department initially denied Ord's request, but acquiesced after President Ulysses S. Grant on November 13, 1874, issued an executive order authorizing distribution of surplus and condemned Army clothing to grasshopper sufferers in Kansas and Nebraska. Despite the limitation of Grant's order to distribute only clothing, Ord and other Army officers in grasshoppered regions also supplied food and other necessities to destitute farmers throughout most of the winter. Major N.A.M. Dudley, who had been sent on an inspection tour of southwestern Nebraska, wrote General Ord in November of 1874 and urged federal assistance in preventing starvation. He wrote, quote, the destitution existing here is much greater than I expected. Relief must be given to these people, or hundreds will starve before the winter is half over. The government must assist these people. The present aid they are receiving is only a drop in the bucket toward relieving future wants, end quote. Kansas officials similarly began to realize that they had underestimated the destruction and that local relief agencies could not support all of the victims through the winter. On December 1, 1874, Kansas Agricultural Secretary Alfred Gray reported to Governor Osborne that as much as 70% of the population was impoverished in the worst-hit counties, saying, quote, destitution is greater than has been supposed. Our people are not beggars, and there have been many cases of suffering discovered where delicacy has hidden it from the public view as long as possible, end quote. The time had come to advertise the need for assistance, even if doing so threatened to tarnish the reputation of Western states or reduce the flow of Eastern investment. As winter edged closer, many Western newspapers that had downplayed the extent of the suffering now urged officials to appeal for outside assistance and provided greater details on the plight of the grasshopper victims. In late October 1874, the Omaha Daily Republican printed a letter from George W. Frost, who described the destitute condition of plague victims and pressed Nebraskans to come to their relief, writing, quote, the number of people to be helped are, from the best authority, believed to be at least 10,000. They must be helped to keep them from actual starvation until next year's harvest, a period of 9 months. We should appeal to the general public. We must put aside all delicacy and pride and send out throughout all of the land the Macedonian cry for their starving. We may as well talk this matter right out and say that with all that has been done and all that we now have the power to do, that 3 weeks will not elapse without actual freezing and starving of men, women, and children. Many of these families, if not helped within 2 weeks, will die. I repeat it, there is not a moment to be lost." End quote. The decision to print Frost's letter indicated that Western newspapers feared widespread starvation, and the damage to the reputation of Western states were such an event to occur, even more than the dreaded negative publicity. The newspaper followed up with an excerpt from Major Dudley's report of what he had seen in the Nebraskan Republican Valley, an excerpt that reinforced the idea that the grasshopper victims were indeed worthy of aid. He wrote, quote, "Thrift, enterprise, industry, and economy was exhibited in and around nearly every poor cabin I visited. While traveling through the valley, I often said to myself, how I wish some of our rich friends in the East, who are living so comfortable, surrounded by so many extravagant luxuries, could only spend one day in the Republican Valley. I know the picture would touch their hearts and loosen their purse strings, and thereby assure these brave people safety through the calamity which they will in no way were responsible for." End quote. Eastern newspapers, troubled by conflicting reports of the damage and suffering caused by the plague, asked residents of grasshoppered regions for firsthand accounts. After receiving a letter from CG of Fort Hays, Kansas, claiming that recent reports had exaggerated the extent of suffering, the Worcester Daily Spy printed a rebuttal by Thomas H. Vail, a bishop of Kansas, who claimed the suffering had not been overstated. Quote, "There is severe suffering and very extensive want, not only in the newly settled counties, where it is really a question between starvation and charitable relief, but also in the older counties with very few exceptions." End quote. Vail's letter went on to explain that the strong interest in the value of our real estate held by wealthy Easterners and corporations, quote, "which naturally desire to prevent influences which may retard immigration," end quote, accounted for the incomplete reporting of the conditions of plague victims. In soliciting help, grasshoppered counties also sent representatives to Eastern states to lecture on the plague, collect donations, and print appeals for aid in the local newspapers. The representatives described sufferers as being worthy of aid and sometimes compared them with the victims of the Chicago fire. Delegates expressed confidence that they could obtain donations by educating Easterners about the destitution hardworking families were suffering as a result of the plague. Similarly, in a statement to the charitable people of the Eastern states, the Clay County Central Relief Committee of Kansas described how the hopes of its industrious residents had been crushed by the grasshoppers. They wrote, quote, "The forepart for the past year was one of great prospect. Everything looked as though our county was on the high road to fortune, and under these delusive prospects, our farmers entered into contracts for farm machinery, repairing their houses, and an extra credit at stores. But alas, the plague reached us, and everything was swept away. In 24 hours, the labor of the year was nothing." End quote. Grasshoppers, not idleness, the commissioners explained, were to blame for the misfortunes of Clay County farmers. The Jewell County Relief Committee of Kansas also sought to paint grasshopper victims as deserving poor. In an appeal to the American people, the committee issued the following statement accompanied by a poem from the committee's chair, A. Hardy. Quote, "Shall we appeal to you in vain in this our day of trial? We believe not. We shall not. You have always responded to the call of humanity. When the ravages of war have filled our country with widows and orphans, in your great heart they had a place. When Chicago smoldered in ruins, the city that sat in splendor along the Atlantic Sea, replying called to the dwellers where the proud magnolias be. From slumber the nation started at the far resounding call. Food for the hungry thousands, they shouted, and clothes for them all. Let the press spread o'er the nation our wail and hungry cry, For we look unto you by thousands. Shall we now hunger and die? We famish is the call that hungry throng must give, till 1,000,000 of hearts respond, Ho, look unto us and live. End quote. Given the prevailing view that only the worthy poor deserved short-term assistance, Jewell County and other grasshopper districts stressed the similarities between the victims of the grasshoppers and those of the Chicago fire. Individuals, banks, corporations, and cities from several eastern states sent aid throughout the winter of 1874 and 75. The Nebraska Relief and Aid Association recorded both monetary and material support from several eastern states and at least 2 foreign countries. In January 1875, Governor Furness reported a total of $68,080.46 in cash and in-kind donations to grasshopper relief. A partial list included $1,000 from the Indiana Grange, 100 tons of coal from Cleveland's leading coal company, $500 from H. Garriston, Second National Bank of Cleveland, $1,200 from the people of Philadelphia, $50 from I.N. Field of Manchester, England, and $25 from E.G. Washburn, Paris. 6-year-old Robbie Coliphant of Orange, New Jersey, donated, quote, half of my money to help the poor people in Nebraska, end quote. Railroads contributed to the relief effort by transporting donations free of charge. Between November 19, 1874 and January 25 of 1875, the Kansas Central Relief Committee received 124 carloads of donations, including 12,160 boxes, barrels, and other packages of supplies. In addition to lending material support, some Easterners participated directly in the relief effort. After witnessing the destruction in Nebraska during a recent visit, Robert Hollingworth of Somerville, Massachusetts, enlisted as an agent of Relief Society of Nuckolls County, quote, for the sole purpose of obtaining relief from the benevolent people of the eastern states, end quote. Newton, Massachusetts Mayor Honorable J.F.C. Hyde joined Hollingsworth as the treasurer of the society. At the height of the national response, the federal government acted to relieve suffering in the grasshopper states. On December 28, 1874, Congress passed a homestead extension to allow farmers who could prove that they suffered a crop loss a leave of absence from their claims until July 1st of 1875. While homesteaders were absent, ideally seeking relief outside the state, no contest could be made upon their claims. On January 25, 1875, Congress passed legislation directing the Secretary of Agriculture to distribute $30,000 worth of seeds to the grasshoppered regions. On February 10 of 1875, legislation introduced by Representative Stephen A. Cobb of Kansas and Senator Phineas W. Hitchcock of Nebraska was passed by Congress and approved by the President to appropriate $150,000 through the proper offices of the Army to distribute surplus Army blankets and clothing to all destitute and helpless persons living on the western frontier. Together, these acts signified the federal government's new commitment to the aid and support of western farmers. At first, grasshoppered states refused or were unable to open their own treasuries to provide assistance to the needy, opting instead to solicit and collect private donations. By the winter of 1874 and 75, however, many state and local officials began calling for public assistance in addition to private aid. Since Nebraska's treasury was nearly empty, Governor Robert W. Furness, in January of 1875, recommended and the state legislature authorized issuing $50,000 in state bonds to purchase seed for grasshopper victims. According to historian Sam S. Kepfield, quote, to use funds from the public treasury for disaster relief was almost unheard of. Public funds were for public uses only, and allowing farmers to carry on at their normal labors did not qualify as public use, end quote. The grasshopper relief effort decreased in the spring of 1875 after farmers had planted new crops with donated seed. The economic and psychological effects of the invasion, however, lingered for several years. According to Stephen R. Kinsella, the grasshopper invasions of the 1870s, quote, started a relationship between agricultural producers and the government that continues to this day, end quote. Similarly, historian and entomologist Jeffrey Lockwood wrote, quote, the federal programs associated with the Rocky Mountain locust and its victims in the 1870s set the stage for the next 125 years of agricultural practices in the United States, end quote. Although another invasion had not occurred along the magnitude of 1874, locusts visited the Great Plains during the next 2 years in large enough numbers, an estimated 3.5 trillion in June of 1875, to cause fear that a repeat of the 1874 disaster was imminent. Each spring since the 1874 invasion, farmers had turned up millions of grasshopper eggs while plowing their fields. Each tiny ovum served as an ominous reminder of the devastation and hardship that the locust caused. In 1876, Governor John S. Pillsbury of Minnesota organized and chaired a conference in Omaha on October 25th and 26th for the governors and scientists from grasshopper states. Its main goal was to discuss ways to combat the grasshoppers and to enlist the help of the federal government to prepare for and prevent future invasions. In his opening remarks, Pillsbury argued that cooperation between grasshopper states and support from federal government was essential, stating, quote, "Considering the sudden and fitful movements of the locusts, the limitless field of their operations, and the mysterious and predatory nature of their inroads, they constitute a formidable enemy with which no single state or community can expect to cope successfully. And it is my profound conviction that an evil which, by threatening our agriculture, threatens the source of productive industry, deserves the prompt and thorough consideration of the general government," end quote. The conference achieved 3 important outcomes. The governors unanimously concluded that the locust problem was too sweeping in its scale and complexity for any state to solve, and federal assistance was desperately needed. The governors provided funds to publish 10,000 copies of a pamphlet outlining methods for controlling the locusts, and they called on the federal government to form and fund an entomological commission of skilled scientists to address the lack of knowledge about the locust. In concluding that the Rocky Mountain locust presented a problem too great for any one state to handle, the governors recognized and justified federal assistance to farmers. Quote, "If it be within the legitimate providence of the federal government to improve our rivers and harbors in order to facilitate the movement of crops, surely the rescue of those crops from destruction is no less an object of its rightful care," end quote. In 1874, the protection and support of Western farmers and their crops represented an internal issue. By 1876, grasshoppered governors accepted and justified a federal government role. Despite this newfound acceptance of federal assistance, the grasshopper states did not depend wholly on the government for support in the event of another invasion. In 1877, for example, the Nebraska legislature passed the Grasshopper Act, which labeled the insect as a public enemy and required all able-bodied citizens to assemble and fight the pest. Calling for a sort of grasshopper army, the law mandated that all male residents between the ages of 16 and 60 perform 2 days' labor eradicating grasshoppers after they had hatched. Noncompliance brought a $10 fine. Similarly, when a warm spring in 1877 caused thousands of grasshopper eggs to hatch prematurely in Dakota Territory, Governor John L. Pennington proclaimed May 4th a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer, and ordered fields with eggs to be burned immediately. Banks, businesses, and schools closed to allow Dakota citizens to observe the proclamation and help ward off a possible invasion. The greatest defense against grasshopper raids did not include conscripted citizen armies, days of fasting, or federal intervention. Settlement moving west proved most effective at preventing future invasions. According to Lockwood, residential, commercial, and agricultural development ultimately caused the extinction of the Rocky Mountain locust in the early 1900s. As settlers pushed west into the Rocky Mountain Plateau, farmers cultivated and irrigated the locust's breeding grounds. Quote, "Western agriculture and the Rocky Mountain locust collided in time and space. Through one of the most spectacular coincidences in agricultural history, early agriculture basically destroyed the permanent breeding grounds of the locusts," end quote. The West could not support both locust and farmer, and the farmer prevailed. The grasshopper relief effort of 1874 and 75 reflected 19th century notions of charity, and strengthened government involvement in promoting the settlement of the West by aiding agricultural producers. By the time the Army stopped distributing federally issued supplies on September 1st of 1875, more than 1 million food rations had been provided to nearly 30,000 adults and children in the Department of the Platte. Dakota, Minnesota, Missouri, and Kansas also received generous amounts of federal aid. The initial reactions by Western newspaper editors and officials to deny the need for outside assistance reflected the widespread belief that welfare should be local and limited. Later, when soliciting donations from other states, Western delegates tried to maintain the public perception of Western farmers as brave, patriotic, and resilient. They also described grasshopper victims as worthy of aid and compared them to the victims of the Chicago fire, which the nation had liberally supported. Skepticism of unfettered charity, a willingness to provide assistance to deserving poor, and the need to exhaust local resources before appealing for outside assistance guided the response to the worst locust invasion in the nation's history. In the end, however, the federal government had to step in, an early example of what is now a typical response to large-scale natural disasters. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcasts, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of the Nebraska State Historical Society, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and get notified when we release new episodes on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.